The subject for tonight is illogical emotions. Now, first thing I have to do is try to convince you that there is such a subject. Some people find this idea difficult to relate to. First of all, they will say emotions are just experiences, very largely feelings. Can you really describe a feeling as logical or illogical? I suppose somebody has a stomach ache, or he has a feeling of thrill, or inspiration, or depression. I mean, these are just things that happen. They could be damaging, or they could be productive, but logical or illogical? I'll tell you that logic belongs in the realm of propositions, beliefs, statements, facts, assertions, and not in the area of feelings. And then people will say, it sounds like if you're going to talk about illogical emotions, that you think that there's something wrong there and we're going to do something about them. But many people are convinced that emotions just happen to you and you don't do them, you don't choose to have them. You have to be careful not to act them out. You don't want to act on them. But the emotion itself, it's just something that happens. I think both of these points of resistance are mistaken, and I want to take them in turn. If I'm not mistaken, my memory doesn't fail me, I believe that what I'm going to tell you now I learned from David Hume. Yes, emotions are feelings, but many emotions portray themselves as responses to something. And if you imagine you're experiencing emotion which is portrayed as a response to X, and X doesn't exist, then you can classify it as an illogical emotion. Let's say, for example, fear. Fear portrays itself as a response to danger. Suppose you can investigate and discover that you're not in danger. And suppose you continue to feel fear. Then there's a sense in which feeling fear is out of place, because it presents itself to you as a warning that you are in danger, and you aren't. That's why phobias sometimes are called irrational fears. People won't fly in airplanes, or afraid of claustrophobia, or agoraphobia, war, or high places. They're irrational because these fears are appropriate as a description of being in danger. I'm not now talking about the fact that fear, you experience a fight or flight impulse, and you're preparing and you're expending energy and focus on it. We're wasting it using other things. All that's true. It's certainly inefficient to be afraid when you're not in danger. But it's worse to that. Imagine a person says, "I feel fear from time to time, but don't worry, it doesn't derail me. I keep working, or I keep studying, and I manage." Still, there's something wrong, because fear is supposed to be the signal of danger, and there isn't any danger there. So when you have feelings that don't correspond to reality, that they portray, then I think you could call them illogical. And there are many of them. A lack of self-esteem. Often you meet people, and you can tell from the way they talk and the way they behave that they suffer from a terrible lack of self-esteem, and you look at them and say, wow, boy, if I had half of what this guy has, I'd be flying. He thinks he's nothing? What's wrong there? or anorexia. I don't know if that's much more common among girls than boys, but you have this girl who's thin as a rail, and she complains of all the blubber that she has, all the extra weight that she has, and how ugly she looks because she's too terribly overweight. You say, look at yourself in the mirror. And she says, yes, see how ugly I am, how heavy I am, how overweight I am. She's 20 pounds underweight. She can't see herself. She can't see herself. It's a really horrible position to be in. But here she is experiencing a feeling of self-devaluation, of self-disgust, completely inconsistent with reality. So I think that is a useful, it's a fruitful way to classify certain feelings as illogical. Now the question will be, it seems almost obvious. To have a feeling that's out of touch with reality means that part of you is out of touch with reality. That's not good. Okay, now, when you take a look at the Torah, take a look at the Jewish tradition has rules for emotions. What emotions are appropriate, what are preferable to what. One of the rules that's absent is don't have illogical emotions. That's absent. The Torah doesn't say don't have illogical emotions. On the contrary, there are circumstances under which the Torah confirms illogical emotions. That's a challenging thought. I learned about emotions at first from my Rabbi Zatzal. He was the one who pointed out the mitzvahs of emotions and the variety and the subtleties, some of which I will share with you. And I began thinking about it from my philosophical perspective, and I thought, well, if it's illogical, then you should certainly, I'm a logician after all. You don't want to lose something illogical. But then I found examples where the Torah certifies illogical emotions. So let me give you an example. You probably know that when something good happens, there's a blessing you make, praising God for the thing that's good. Either it's shechianu, if it's for an individual, or it's a tova meitiv, if it's something which a group of people, like for example, a parent dies, and all the children inherit, so it would be a tova meitiv. And then there's a blessing for something bad that happens, dayan ha'emes, knowledge, God's truthful judgment. The Gemara asks, what bracha would you make on something that's both good and bad? Now, here you have to be very careful because the Gemara has a very specific idea in mind. Here's what the Gemara is not talking about. Now, this may shock you, but this is the way the halacha works. Let's suppose that a man dies, and he's very wealthy, and his children are inheriting him. So they make the bracha dayan ha'emes on the death, on the loss of the father, and they make shechianu or tova meitiv on the money at the same time. How callous can you be? Rejoicing over money when your father just died? Yeah, that's the way human beings are. Part of you is grieving for the father, and part of you is happy that you got the inheritance. I was present when the child of a Rebbe, the son of a Rebbe, who became a Rebbe after him, was sitting Shiva, and another Rebbe, big Rebbe, came to Rabbi Menachem Ovel to comfort him. And they talked about the one who had died and what he had done, how great he was, and everything else. And then, as the visitor got up to leave, he said, Mazel Tov Rebbe. Because his father, now having died, the one sitting Shiva became Rebbe. And he gave him Mazel Tov. Because that was very good for him. We're not talking about that. As you'll see, the Gemara is not talking about that. That kind of case is easy. If you have something going on, it has a good aspect and a bad aspect, you make both brachos. No, the Gemara is talking about a case like this. A person has a field, and he's growing wheat, and the wheat is ripe. Next week he's going to harvest the crop. But at the border of his field, there is flowing a river. And there's a sudden flood, overflow, crest of the river, and water floods his field and destroys his crop. That's bad. But In so doing, the river water deposits silt from the riverbed and thereby fertilizes his field so that his field becomes much more productive. And by the end of 3 years from now, he'll have a sizable product, a sizable profit because of the flood. That's good. And this is the Gemara's question. What blessing does he say under those circumstances? And the answer is, he says, only the blessing on something bad. Dayan Hamas. Not the blessing on something good. And the reason is because the bad thing is immediate, happening now. Intellectually, he knows that 3 years from now he'll have a profit. But that's 3 years from now. So you say, okay, so what? There's a real world, and the real world has in it tomorrow and next year and the next year. They're all parts of the real world. That's true. But tomorrow is present in front of you, and 3 years from now is distant from you. So you say, well, so what? Intellectually, you have the difficulty about thinking about the past or the future or distances. That's right, but emotionally it makes a big difference because your emotions are tied to the present. Things that happen to you now are felt in a way much different from things that happened 3 years ago. How do you feel about them now? There's just a faint ember from the past. When you are planning summer vacation in November, it's not very exciting. In February, it's much more exciting. And in May, since in 2 weeks you're going to be on vacation, it's very exciting. And when you get to the vacation, that's a peak. And then in the fall, you tell your friends about it. Well, you uploaded it to your Facebook page in the meantime. But by January or December or February of the next year, it's a memory. Your emotions are tied to the present. And you make blessings on your emotions. You make blessings on your emotions. So, for example, there's a blessing that people make. There's a blessing that's designated for getting a new important item of clothing. I will warrant that you have never made that blessing. I have never made that blessing. They, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, when you wore a jacket for 5 years, then you turned it inside out. And you wore it again for another 5 years. And then when it was in tatters, you hoped that you had enough money to buy another jacket. You bought a jacket once in 10 years, then you made a blessing. That was a big deal. That was something you looked forward to, hoped that you would be able to achieve, and happy to made a big deal. Today, they put a little slit in the side. All these are old-fashioned. Throw them out to the rummage, you get an all new wardrobe, because you have to keep in style. That's not what the blessing was made for. You don't have that thrill and that thanksgiving to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for its happening. The blessing is made for the emotion. So in the case of the river, the devastation of working 8 months to produce the crop and anticipating the harvest next week and collecting it and either selling it or milling it and making bread and so on and so on, and to have that go down the drain, to have that washed away in front of you, is emotionally painful. And the thrill of the profit 3 years from now is not a thrill now. It'll be a thrill when you put it in the bank 3 years from now. So you only make the blessing on the one which causes you a present emotion. And here, logically, they're both as real. You have no doubt you're not planning to die in 6 months. You have no doubt you're going to be here and you're going to enjoy it. Logically, they're both on a par, but you only make one, not the other one. Because the one is tied to the emotion. Now you say, well, but the emotion of devastation is a short-sighted emotion. If my emotions were in touch with the reality, then, and weren't limited in time the way they are, in fact, then my total emotion would be emotion of happiness. It would be like the case in the Gemara of the cow breaking its leg, and when the farmer was working on the leg of the cow, he discovered a chest full of broken coins. How does he feel? Great! Let my cow break another leg. If it's going to get me a chest of golden coins, I'll have it happen every day, right? Because it's present. So the fact that your emotion is limited to the present and doesn't take into account the future benefit, that means your emotion is, in part, out of touch with reality. and yet you make a blessing on it. So it comes out that the blessing reflects an emotion, which in the terms that I described at the beginning is illogical. And the blessing certainly certifies that the emotion is appropriate. You want to take a question? No? Okay, yeah.
I was wondering exactly what you were saying, right? It would seem like it would have to be based on the emotions, because if you just based on it in the sense of like good and bad, then in the long run, everything is to the good. So it wouldn't, right, it wouldn't make sense to have any blessings to the bad. And so I was wondering about that, and you kind of brought it home, which your point must hold, that to some extent the Torah must be certifying illogical emotions.
Okay, so now let's see. Now you introduced an idea. In the end, things are going to be good, and so right. Where'd you get that idea from?
Well, if Hashem makes the world and it's for the best, then ultimately it all has to turn out for the best.
All has to turn out for the best. Okay, that's certainly a familiar Jewish idea. I'm glad you brought it in. I'm glad you added it to the discourse. I'm glad that you provided us with the extra background of that idea. Don't you see that that's what the Gemara was talking about? Didn't care about fields and floods and streams and wheat. It's the difference because it's what's happening now is destroying the crop, and 3 years from now it's going to make a profit, right? That's what the Gemara is talking about. Very often the Gemara will be investigating a profound philosophical issue and will clothe it in the picture of a particular halacha. So you're not adding extra background. That's the Gemara's subject. It's just putting it in a very, very practical and poignant form. But that's the exact idea. Things that are bad now and will become good later, and you make a blessing on it. So that's exactly what you're saying is exactly right. It says in the Gemara that when the Mashiach comes and things are much better, we won't make dayan ha'emes anymore. If you read Rashi carefully, there are people who make out of this more than it deserves, I think. Rashi says because things that are bad won't happen then, only things that are good will happen then. That means to say they're good immediately, and you feel the support and happiness in them immediately, and then the emotion will support that. But in our world, we have this emotion, and if the two were simultaneous, we wouldn't have it. As I say, with a farmer with a broken leg, he finds a chest of gold coins. If they happen simultaneously, the broken leg wouldn't bother him at all. It's only because it's in the future that it has time to bother him. And then we say, well, then it's really out of touch with the total reality, and it is, and yet the Torah certifies it. So when I discovered this idea, I thought to myself, this is really interesting. A rule that don't have illogical emotions would be simple, clear, well-defined, and would feel intuitively very, very satisfying. Now we're being told that rule is wrong. So what is the right rule? So as far as I've been able to discover, there's no answer to what is the right rule. In different circumstances, the Torah tells us to have different types of emotions, and I haven't found a simple rule which determines what's the right emotion in the various circumstances. Maybe there is one, but I haven't discovered it. So it means, we're put into a situation where we do it piecemeal. For each situation, we have to look up the sources and see what kind of blessing should be made, what kind of emotion to have in that circumstance, and to work with it that way. Question? Yeah.
I don't know of situations in which we would make a blessing on potential things, but in this instance, wouldn't it be that we're making a blessing for the bad because of the accident or whatever occurred, and then the situation where the good eventually happens when you make a blessing on that, since the good didn't actually happen yet, just a potential.
I guess it depends upon how you define the difference between a good and only a potential. If you are seeking investment to start a business, and somebody says, here's $250,000, you aren't making any profit, you haven't built the business yet, you haven't got customers yet, and so on and so on, but I think you would make a blessing on getting the investment. The investment is just a potential. It's potential for building a business and making a profit. And you get there yet, but for you, that potential itself, you seek it, you want it, you worked for it, and now it came through, and you would make a blessing on that. It's not the difference between potential and actual. It's a question of where your emotions are.
Also, based on that too, in a situation where something good is happening, like if my field gets flooded, but I know it's going to get fertilized, or it's going to produce benefit for me, if the person doesn't have a negative emotion towards that, if all they have is happiness of the fact that they realize, oh, this is good for my field, this is good for my crops, then would that be an example in which they would still make the blessing for something bad happening?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think it really is tied to the emotion. And one of the Gemara's examples is Tovas Yam. His ship at sea sank. He's a merchant, and he's bringing merchandise, and he's been invested in the ship and in the merchandise, and it sank on the way, and he nothing came. So that's one of the cases which is brought where you make dayan emes. But if I'm a merchant and I have 12 ships that sail the seas, and every year 2 or 3 ships sink, and I have insurance, I'm not stupid. Lloyd's, I'm insured by Lloyd's of London, right? And the years from January 1st to January 1st, it's now December 22nd, and only 1 ship has gone down this year. Now I hear about a 2nd ship that went down. I don't think I would make dayan emes on that. Every year 2 or 3 ships go down, and I'm insured. This year will be 2 instead of 3. That's really pretty good. Since it doesn't bother me, since it doesn't devastate me, so I'm not unhappy about it, I take with equanimity. I don't believe you make the blessing. It has to feel like a loss. You have to feel, hurt and undone in a certain way. That's what the blessing goes to. The blessing goes on the emotion. Yeah.
I mean, just there's certain level of emotion that certain potentials could provoke in your mind.
I just gave an example, right? When you got an investment to build a business, that's a potential.
Right.
And I said you would make a blessing on that.
Right.
So my point in the Gemara is not that every time there's a flood, this is what you do. My point in the Gemara is portraying a situation. It's a situation which would be normal to happen, that wouldn't always happen. And in that normal situation, 2 things are occurring, one now and one 3 years from now. And you only make the blessing on the one that's happening now. And I think the difference is because what's happening now causes an emotional reaction now, and what you know is going to happen in the future doesn't cause an emotional reaction now. For example, with punishment, anticipating punishment tomorrow is very different from anticipating punishment 5 years from now. Very difficult to get motivated by the thought. That's why people don't stop smoking. Whereas if a person wants to join the football team, and it's going to start in September, it's now July, and he thinks, I better stop smoking because I want to join in September. If they catch me smoking, they'll kick me off. And I want that. That's much different from saying, when you're 68, you lose 2 years of life. Because it's just further in time. That's all. The emotional reaction that gives you the motivation is much weaker when it's further off in time.
Yeah, because I don't know, I thought about a very extreme example, but like, let's say I bought a lottery ticket. So this has the potential of becoming millions of dollars, right?
Yeah.
But I'm not going to make a blessing on the potential of this ticket, like, even if it could be... I don't know.
Well, of course not. First of all, because the potential is vanishingly small. But also, how much money did you spend on the ticket? $10?
Yeah,
Well, if it's such a terrific thing, buy 20 more. Nah. Not such a big deal. Not such a big deal. People told me they don't buy lottery tickets to win the money. They buy lottery tickets for the thrill of the suspense. This is something like addicts like that. Okay, so let me share with you what I think is going on with the emotional side. Give you an idea of how such an idea of making a blessing on an illogical emotion could be anchored in a certain philosophical context, which would make sense out of it. And just give you an idea of how far you would have to go, I think, to analyze these types of cases. I made a hint before. I said, but look, today and 3 years from now, not difficult, more difficult to think about 3 years from now than it's to think about today. To the mind, it doesn't matter. A human being is composed of body and soul. They're very different. One of the differences between body and soul is that the body is strictly limited to a particular slot in space-time. And that drastically limits its capabilities. Your eyes can see only until the next opaque surface. Your ears can only hear that which causes vibrations in the air in the vicinity of your eardrums. You can only touch things, taste things with which you are in direct contact. You can only detect aromas from a short distance. Distance in time and distance in space cause the body to become less and less effective. Memory, the older a thing is, further back it is in your past, generally, the harder it is to remember. Anticipate. You can pretty well anticipate tomorrow's weather, but you can't anticipate the weather 6 months from now, or the economy 6 months from now, or your health 6 months from now. So your ability to think, to understand, to predict, to control is very much limited in time and space. Your mind isn't limited like that at all. You think of thinking about yesterday, last year, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago. Is it getting harder and harder? Are you beginning to sweat after 1,000? Wait a minute, don't go so fast. From 1,000 to 4,000, so let's give me 5 or 10 minutes to work myself up to that. No! 1,000, 4,000, instantaneously, without any effort whatsoever. Same with space. Here, Los Angeles, the moon, the sun. Time and space are no barriers to the mind at all. And the mind, in our point of view, is a feature of the soul. So now, when we are told that we can't dismiss illogical emotions, now illogical takes on a more poignant definition. The emotions are tied to the body. That's why they're tied to the present and to the physical space that you're in. And the mind is independent of those limitations. And it's the mind that determines what's logical and what's illogical. And that's why things distant in time and space can be just as important logically to you as things that are close to you in time and space. Then the message in don't discard illogical emotions, part of that message is don't discard the body. Don't discard the body. You are embodied. You are a body and a soul. This body is as much as an essential part of your nature as your soul is. And if you, so to speak, made a project of wiping out illogical emotions, the philosophical message would be the mind rules, the body, is, if it gets in the way, has to be obliterated. And that's wrong. That's not the Jewish message. The Jewish message is to harmonize. That is to say, to manage and to develop the body into such a way as it can participate with the soul in a joint project, not just simply to wipe it out of the way. So that when you make a blessing on an illogical emotion, one thing that it's reminding you about is that the rightfulness of the body. Let's think mourning over a loss. Close family member dies, and the person is mourning. The Bach says it's impossible not to feel pain. The Gemara points out quite clearly that there's no mitzvah to feel pain, but it's impossible not to feel pain. So now, someone says, wait a minute, it's not a mitzvah, you shouldn't do it. Mitzvahs define all your responsibilities and all the things that are valuable. Well, maybe not, because the Tur and the Shulchan Aruch explain, when you make the bracha dayan ha'emes, when something bad happens, the Gemara says you're supposed to make that blessing with joy. With joy. What are you happy about? Well, the Shulchan Aruch puts together the blessings on good things, the blessing on bad things in the same paragraph. And the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch explain as follows. When something good happens, you make the blessing on the event that happened, because the event that happened is a good event. And on the joy you have in the event. But when something bad happens, you can't make the blessing on the bad thing that happened. You can't avoid feeling pain. And if the Gemara says you have to make it with simcha, you have to explain where some kind of simcha will come from. And it's impossible to have simcha from a bad event which causes you pain. That can't be the source of the simcha. So the Torah and Shulchan Aruch say something, I think, really quite surprising. They say, when a person's sitting Shiva, when he's an oval, when he's a mourner, he has mitzvahs to do. Now, to do mitzvahs is hard when you're in pain, especially when you're in pain because you know that the Creator decided this person's life should end. It's very hard to do. And serving God while you're in pain is a very precious service of God. And you have been selected to perform this precious service before God, and that's where the joy comes from. The joy comes from being able to perform this precious service before God, which you couldn't do if you weren't in pain. So, the pain is not a mitzvah. You're not commanded to be in pain. If you weren't in pain, you shouldn't stick yourself with needles to make yourself in pain. But the pain isn't indifferent, because the pain is an opportunity to perform this kind of precious service which will give you joy. Here's another example of where the Torah certifies, as you said before, you realize what you were going on, you wouldn't be in pain. Just like when the animal breaks its leg and you find a pot of gold coins, at that point you don't worry about the broken leg of the cow. That's true, you don't. But here, it says the Bach, it's impossible not to be in pain over the loss of a close relative, a parent, let's say. And that being the case, the pain is not something you should do, it's something that happens to you. But then it's precious. It is precious because it enables you to do this type of service. This, without the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch telling me, I would have never dreamt of this. And by the way, Mishnah Berurah there says something else, which I don't understand why he says it, and neither you or people who watch the video will find it. I would love to hear about it. Mishnah Berurah says that when you undergo this pain, it is a cleansing for your transgressions. And that's where the joy comes from. You're cleaner now than you were before. The Baruch is wiping away your transgressions. Well, that's certainly true, but why? I don't know why the Mishnah Berurah has to mention it when the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch are giving a very, very different explanation for the joy. It seems to me a very logical explanation. I don't know why the Mishnah Berurah felt that he needed to do it. It's just an additional footnote. This is something in addition he should know. Usually he explains what the Shulchan Aruch says. Anyway, this is another example of where something which you otherwise wouldn't think of as a positive part of life, the pain itself, the experience of pain, becomes a positive part of life because it enables you to do a special kind of mitzvah. Now, I want to give you one more example before I turn to the second half. This I heard from my Rabbi many times. He even published it. We have many customs which are called Zeicher l'Churban, remembering the destruction of the temple. So when you will get married, probably most communities have the custom that they put ashes on your forehead to remember the destruction of the temple. And under the chuppah, you will step on a glass and smash it, which the Gemara says, in the case of the Gemara, when it happened, it was a very expensive goblet because people were rejoicing too unrestrainedly, and he wanted to shock them, to tone them down, so he broke this goblet, and it did shock them. And in remembrance of that, we step on the glass. Or if you make a new apartment for yourself, that's when the halacha applies. Now when you buy an apartment that others made, then you should leave a patch of wall unfinished, raw, as if to say, if the Beis Hamikdash is destroyed, I can't have a fully plastered, painted, decorated house. Part of it has to be raw because my life has this raw spot in it. are the various things that we do as zecher l'churban. But then there are things that we do called zecher l'mikdash. A different term, and they're very different. For example, at the Passover Seder, we eat matzah, we eat mor, and then we eat the Hillel sandwich. Because Hillel used to eat the matzah, the mor, and the Purim Pesach together in one sandwich. So after eating matzah separately and eating mor separately, we then take 2 pieces of matzah, take some more, put it together, and we eat it as a sandwich. Zecher lemikdash ki Hillel. Reminder of the temple according to Hillel. We are not introducing an element of mourning for the destruction of the temple into the Seder. That's not what's going on. Well, if that's not what's going on, what is going on? What is going on is that although the physical temple is destroyed, something of the reality of the temple still exists. And we are accessing it. We are relating to it. This is a positive relationship to some remainder of the temple's presence in our times. It's almost the opposite. Same thing true with Lulav and Esrog. The mitzvah of Lulav and Esrog is everywhere in the world other than the temple, it's one day. First day, that's it, put it away. In the temple, it's 7 days, okay, one day is Shabbos, Chazal says not to do it, but it's basically the whole week. We, as you know, take Lulav and Esrog the whole week. Why do we do that? Zecher l'mikdash, said Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. The fact that the mikdash was done 7 days, we should also do it 7 days. We are not introducing mourning into Sukkot. That's not what's going on. There's still something available, still some reality there, and we're relating to it. Then our attitude towards the mikdash is double. Number one, we mourn for what we've lost. And number two, we treasure what's left. We act out what's left. And it's the synthesis of those two attitudes that will hopefully give us the merit to witness and participate in the rebuilding of the temple, carrying both of them. So here, and this of course generates a different emotion, but both of these examples that I'm giving you are examples on Yom Tov. Yom Tov is the main mitzvah of Simcha, v'samachta b'chagecha. So it comes out that relating to the temple is an element of simcha, of joy. Not just, so if you hear that, you think, joy, but why should I have any joy? Temple's not here. Then you learn some of it is still here. That's why you're doing it. So this case, it turns out to be logical, but only logical in a metaphysical sense. Something which is beyond what you could observe and what we read in the history books. These are examples of the way in which emotions function. I remember, so it's very vivid in my mind, one Purim. In the midst of the celebrations, I was together with my Rebbe Zatzal. He said to me, don't think I've forgotten the Haman who succeeded. Meaning, Hitler, Yamach Shemo, wiped out a third of the Jewish people. In the midst of the celebration of Purim, he was also thinking about the Holocaust. I thought, wow, he has a very rich life. He has a very, very rich emotional life that he can pull the two of them together and integrate them together. You know, to stand in awe of things like that. So that's why I said this is a piecemeal investigation, and this should just enlighten you to the idea that the mitzvahs of there are mitzvahs of emotions, and not to take for granted that there's a simple rule which emotions to have is not simple at all. Now, people who will tell you that emotions are beyond control, in my experience, are working with a certain model. Can you decide what emotions to have? I think you can't, although I did have one student who said he could. So I don't know whether to trust him, or maybe he was doing drugs at the time. I don't know. It sounds to me a little bizarre. You know, we struggle with our emotions, and certainly if it's a question of being told you should have a certain emotion that you don't have, let alone not having one that you do have. So if the model in your mind is, Well, just will it. Make up your mind that you're not going to have it. That's probably terribly unrealistic. But manipulating emotions, even our own, there are whole industries that are designed to do that. Let's take practical measures that people actually use. A person's feeling down, unhappy, and a little bit depressed. He may put on a piece of music, which he knows cheers him up. The piece of music makes him cheerful. Yes, it does. It causes an emotion in him. Or he may read something, or he may call someone to talk to, or take a walk in the forest. He knows that these things cause certain emotions in him. So we're not helpless with respect to emotions. We're helpless to choose, to will emotions. But we can manipulate our activities and our environment in such a way as to bring about the emotions that we're supposed to have. In an older form of English, some people used to say, I'm so angry, I'm going to go chop wood. They didn't mean, well, I've got lots of energy now, so it's a good time to lay up wood for the winter. No, what they meant was having a strenuous emotion like anger requires physical strength. And if I exhaust myself, I won't have enough strength to be angry. And that's true. So by chopping the wood, you dissipate your anger. So are you helpless with respect to anger? Well, you can't just decide not to be angry, but there are things you can do to dissipate it. So this is the key in terms of the mitzvos of emotion, to know the practical methods by which you can generate the emotion that's required. Now, you know that Shabbos is a time of simcha, of joy, even though there's no mitzvah to be joyful on Shabbos. There's v'samachta b'chagecha, which means to be joyful on the holidays. There's ivdu Hashem b'simcha, which means all the service of God you should do with simcha, but nothing about, from Friday afternoon to Saturday night, that 25 hours you should be joyful. There's no such thing. Nevertheless, the Zmiros of Shabbos talk about simcha all the time. Menucha v'simcha, or la Yehudi. They all talk about simcha. So what's going on? If there's no mitzvah to be joyful on Shabbos, why does the liturgy and the songs, poetry, emphasize simcha to such a great extent? And the answer to this was given by a great Hasidic thinker called the Torah Tmima. Oh, I hear the protests rising from the audience. The Torah Tmima wasn't the Chassid. Well, you take what I'm going to tell you now in his name, and you make your own judgment whether you should count as a Hasidic or not. The Torah Tmima says there is a pasuk in the Torah which describes, listen carefully, describes simcha on Shabbos. I didn't say commands, this describes it. And you can try this with your black-hatted, velvet and yarmulke friends. Where is the pasuk in the Torah which describes simcha on Shabbos? Anybody know? Okay, there's a mitzvah to make trumpets, 2 silver trumpets. And there are days in which you're supposed to blow the trumpets. And the pasuk says you should blow the trumpets biyom simchaschem, on the day of your joy, u'moadeichem, and your holidays, u'rashi chodshechem, and the first days of the month. That's when you should blow it. Okay, let's figure it out. It's Q and holidays at the Rosh Chodesh, the beginning of the month. What could be the Q sitting in a sequence like that? Q, holidays, and the beginning of the month. Shabbos, right? It's higher in sanctity, comes more often, right? So, and the Torah describes Shabbos there with the words biyom simchaschem. So Gemara says Elu hashabbosos, right? Okay, so the Torah, interestingly, is calling it a day of simcha without telling you v'samachta b'shabbosos. Doesn't say that, but it's calling it that. So on that pasuk, the Torah Tmima says, since it's not phrased as a command, and yet it's describing reality, what's going on? He said, I'll tell you what's going on. The Medrash tells us that when HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world, Shabbos is Zeichel L'Maaseh Bereishis, right? When he created the world and he finished it, on the 7th day, he celebrated the finishing of the creation like a king who builds a palace when the palace is complete, he celebrates. He brings together all of his assembled officials and people who are responsible, and he makes a celebration. And our weeks repeat the first week of creation. And that means every seventh day there's a celebration. Celebration above. Now, a Jew whose soul is attuned to what's going on above feels the simcha from above on Shabbos. And that's where the simcha comes from. Now you tell me that's not a Hasidic idea. That's a quintessential Hasidic idea. So obviously the Torah to me must have been Hasidic, at least in heart, at least sometimes. Right? But here's an example of something which is an emotion that's appropriate to have without a commandment by focusing on that supernal reality and being receptive. You know, emotions are like sympathetic vibrations. I don't know if you know what sympathetic vibrations are, but if you have let's say two violins, and one violinist plays a note on one of the strings without putting his fingers on the strings, just plays it with the bow, and there's another violin sitting there, the same string will vibrate on the other violin, even though no one touched it. And if you want to try this on your own, get a piano and do the following experiment. Take, let's say, a note of C, close to the top of the piano. Press the key down very gently so that the hammer doesn't strike the string, but hold it down so that the hammer is not touching the string, stopping it from vibrating. So at this point, there's no sound at all. Now go down an octave to a C, one octave below, and hit that C hard and let it go immediately. Just bang it. And you'll hear the one that you're holding open humming, because that's called an overtone. The first overtone of a pitch is the one octave above. It means the lower string is vibrating in several different ways at once, and one of them is in sync with the vibration of the higher string, and you can hear the higher string humming because it's in tune with the overtone of the lower string. So that's the idea, although I don't know if the Torah Tzvi was thinking of a musical analogy. I happen to be.
What's it called, the phenomena?
Sympathetic vibrations.
Sympathetic.
Yeah. So if your soul is, so to speak, in tune with what's going on above, you will naturally feel simcha. So here's another example of an emotion which you can have, but the way you get it requires a considerable amount of preparation and mental focus. You have that vision in mind of the pleasure above, of completing the act of creation, and you're sitting now in a reenactment of that moment of completing, then you can have that pleasure as well. So the fact that we can't decide to have emotions doesn't mean that we can't produce emotions. We produce emotions in a variety of ways, and the mitzvos of emotions require us to make use of the means that are available to us to be able to feel those emotions. Some of you have heard me talk about love, of Dessa's essay on loving kindness, chesed, where he has a whole technique for producing love, which is very important because in the case of love, people feel helpless entirely. You're telling me I should love? That's almost quixotic. Love is just something that happens between people. Either it happens or it doesn't happen, but it's not true. But that's the challenge. The challenge is to find the ways of patterns of behavior and structure the environment so that the emotion that's required will take place. Yeah?
Yeah, I have a question. On the pasuk that you were mentioning with the two trumpets, you're saying it wasn't listed as like a commandment to actually have two trumpets blow?
Oh no, for the trumpets it's a commandment, but it defines the days on which they shall be blown, the trumpets. And one of the days in which you should blow it is B'yom Simchaschem, the day of your joy.
We don't blow trumpets.
So it was in the temple. It was a mitzvah. It's in the temple, right? It was part of the service in the temple. And Chazal say, when the pasuk says, blow it on the day of your joy, you mean when I make a bris, I should, when I make a chasana, I should blow the trumpets? No, Chazal explained, Yom Simchasim Elu Shabbosos. So in the temple, they blew the trumpets, especially on Shabbos. And the description of Shabbos in the Torah is the day of joy, from which I, with making 2 + 2 = 4, say, aha, so Shabbos is a day of joy. That's not a command. It's just a description. But then the Torah says, so what does the description mean? How does it become real? And he gives this explanation as to how it becomes real. Very beautiful Torah. Yeah.
So I don't agree with this position, but I wanna hear a counter position to it. So I like what you said about the idea that there's an idea here not to discard the body, right, and the emotions that are tied to it. One thing we were learning currently in the Parsha was that the Torah does allow for a situation where after your 6 years are up, you can condemn yourself to a longer period of slavery. And it's obviously not happy about that. Like, it's not happy that you've made that choice, but it allows for it.
Right.
And so I wonder if the situations were allowing for blessings for the bad, or blessings that are commenting on the bad, even though that's illogical, maybe it's trying to say, well, okay, if you were really good, you could take a better perspective on this. Your emotions would be more in tune with the greater reality. But because you are where you are, we're going to permit this.
Good try.
Okay.
Good try. No, you're thinking well. But what you left out is the blessing. You would not make a blessing on staying with your Adon until the Jubilee by getting a hole in your ear. Getting a hole in your ear, you would not make a blessing on that. If you make a blessing on it, that's a certification that it's something that's good. Yeah. No, it's not that. And this has other reverberations. There's a sefer called Birkat Shmuel, very late sefer. And I remember seeing it in Kedushin. He asks, what is the permission that we have to sleep? The Pasuk in Yeshua says, V'gisa v'yom v'layla, if you're meditating on Torah or speaking Torah day and night. Well, midnight is part of nighttime. It says you should be meditating on Torah. Do you have to feel compromised? I'm speaking your language now. Oh, but I can't help it. So it's, too bad. I'm so weak. If I could just be up all the time and so forth and so on. That would be rebelling against having a body. And that's something which is inappropriate. You should say, Kodesh Baruch Hu gave me sleep as a way to serve him by refreshing my strength. I'll tell you the granddaddy of all the places of this. The Gemara says there's a difference of opinion how you should celebrate holidays. Because there are prayers to say, and there's Torah to learn, but there's feasting, which is also part of the holiday. So how should you divide it up? One, I always forget which one is which. One says 50-50. Spend half the time praying and learning, spend half the time feasting. The other one says no, 90-10. Either way. Could be 90% davening and learning and 10% feasting, or 90% feasting and 10%, a quick tefillah and a short mishnah and back to the wine. Okay, the Gemara says, however, everyone agrees that on Shavuos, you can't do 90-10. Now, I'm glad you're sitting down. You can't do 90% prayer and study and 10% feasting. You can't do that on Shavuos. Everybody agrees to that. 10% feasting isn't enough for Shavuos. There has to be serious feasting on Shavuos. Really? Why is that? Right? And Rashi says, because the body has to rejoice on Shavuos also. Wow. That's interesting. That doesn't sound bid'evet, does it? Right? You're forbidden to take 90% learning and speak. Even if you're able to do it, you're forbidden to do it. So now, someone says intuitively, listen, Rabbi, on Shavuos, we celebrate the receipt of the Torah from heaven. What could be a better celebration than to spend the whole day learning? And the answer, I believe, I don't think of this as a speculation because I think it's the spirit of the Gemara quite there, but I didn't see it black and white. The answer is very simple. Because when Moses went up to get the Torah, the angel said, don't give it to them, give it to us. We'll keep it better. We'll bring divine energy into the world. Everyone will benefit. Give it to us. So God said to Moses, answer them. And he said, is a mitzvah of honoring your parents. Do you have parents that you have to honor? The Torah says that we were slaves in Egypt. Remember, were you slaves in Egypt? The angels were pleased with Moses' answers, and they made peace with him, and they gave him gifts, and that's why we have the Torah. The question is, what was the argument? I mean, how did he win the argument? And the way I understand the argument was won is this. You're right, angels. You're on a much higher level than we are. You're much more faithful than we are. You will, in fact, produce a more consistent performance of the mitzvahs than we will. But God wants the Torah to penetrate the whole of the creation down to the bottom. And we live in the mud. We live in the bottom. That's why we have to have it, because it's got to go all the way to the bottom. So by acknowledging that we live at the bottom, and the angels are superior to us, live on a much higher madrega than everything else, they were very happy with that. But that's the truth. It's got to go down to the bottom. Now, you're going to spend your Shavuos learning Torah, I'll give it to the angels. No, I gave it to you because you're at the bottom. And the bottom means the body. And it has to be involved, because the Torah has to penetrate all the way to the bottom. That's the idea. So that's certainly not b'diavad. That's the chatchila. That's the way I created you. You are what you are because you are soul and body together. Don't rebel against the creation that the Kodesh Baruch Hu gave you. That's the deep message in this idea. Okay.